All right. Welcome everyone. See people filtering in here on Zoom, so I'll check the waiting list and let people in as we go along. Um, Thanks everyone for taking the time to participate before we all break for the holiday. This is a tough time of year to squeeze in a webinar, and we promise to keep this light before not only the holiday but before the weekend here. So just to introduce ourselves as people are filtering in, I'm Peter. I'm the CEO here at Anania Bailey, joined by Dustin, our accounts director, and also Nick, our creative director. Uh, Thank you both for joining. Um, Nick, Dustin, and I, every webinar, we like to just mention it makes a little bit more of an engaging and immersive webinar if folks keep their cameras on. We like that. If you can't, we understand. We ask that you also, you mute your mics until we pause to ask for questions. If you do have a question along the way, feel free to use Zoom's raise your hand function, and I'll monitor that and call you in at a natural break. And also just feel free to ask questions in chat. I'll be monitoring that as well. Whoops, my bad. So we like to start these webinars by framing the challenge. There's certainly a challenge that led to Nick, Dustin, and I coming up with this topic. And I know we're all communications professionals, and we've all been on a ride since 2020 with the pandemic. And marketing budgets have adjusted accordingly. So I just kind of wanted to quickly go through this before we dive in. And I think something that illustrates it is this graph from the Federal Reserve that tracks gross domestic product quarterly. And during when the pandemic started, GDP went negative faster than during the Great Recession. And so that was a time when a lot of executives and marketing professionals were really unsure what to do, and a lot of marketing budgets were cut. And then following that, the government came up with the PPP program, tried to stabilize businesses by with stimulus and other programs, and marketing budgets. People just felt a little bit more secure spending on marketing. And during this time, interest rates were lower, so money for executives were cheaper. So they were more willing to invest in their marketing. So the economy really was taking off. And then inflation was a concern. And so the Federal Reserve adjusted interest rates, worried about inflation. And this is kind of where in the beginning of 2023, we kind of felt executives and marketing professionals say, hey, we want to put the brakes on things right now until we see if we have soft landing in the economy or not. And Nick, Dustin, and I, we kind of see a lot of brands, a lot of organizations we're working with and our peers are working with are starting to feel more comfortable now and are starting to come back with their marketing budgets. So that's kind of the challenge we want to talk about today, is a little bit of navigating these unprecedented times, but also the challenge of reawakening your marketing plan, your marketing efforts, and your marketing budget. And with that, Nick and Dustin, I'll let you guys take it away.
Excellent. Well, I think, Dustin and I were talking about this, and we tried to break this down in a couple of ways that made sense and didn't and simplified how you should think about kind of re-entering the advertising marketing world. And the first one here is really just all about reevaluating what your position is. If you've taken any kind of break, the world has gotten different. Your audience has changed a lot. The first one that I really want to highlight here is Gen Z consumerism and workforces. Gen Z is increased in the consumer and workforce spaces quite a bit. I think it's easy for people to dismiss Gen Z. I think it's something that we tend to do a lot of because you kind of still think of them as kids. Um, Millennials are in their 40s. Gen Z have been in the workforce for 7 years. The population that probably is doing less and less relevancy to your company is really the boomer generation that are on their way out of a lot of these spaces. Um, because that generation has changed and taken on a bigger role, there's a couple of things that have really informed decisions that are made around not only B2B purchasing and relationship building, but also B2C buying. The first one is authenticity. If you've been out for a year or two, or you kind of are jumping back in after reevaluating during COVID, authenticity is going to be more important to your marketing than it's ever been before. That we hosted a whole separate webinar around Gen Z, and we can get into that more deeply in questions. But making sure that your brand feels authentic and the marketing and website that you have feels genuine is really important. The second thing are shared values. So questions around the climate crisis, racial equity. These aren't kind of politicized issues as much as they've become mainstream considerations for a lot of your audience. So whether it's having a statement on your website around diversity, or whether it's demonstrating diversity in your marketing materials, or demonstrating, a commitment to sustainable materials. All of these things are going to be way more important than they were even a couple of years ago. And the last one is quality. And I feel like that might feel dumb, but audiences care about quality more than they have before. The idea that I can buy something cheap to give me a quick replacement, or a Band-Aid to a solution that I have, whether that's from a corporate perspective or purchasing perspective, that's gone. It's probably because of a combination of kind of that shared emphasis on values. Eco consciousness, I think, is relevant for all companies and all consumers, but also a lot of people have been dealing with economic trauma, from the recession to COVID to inflation, supply chain issues. All of this really adds up to people being very aware that you need a quality build, you need repairability. One of my favorite lines is when somebody says there's it requires no additional work after you purchase it. Probably means that you can't repair it either. So these are all, I think, really important elements to keep in mind when you're talking about just purely, number one, your audience has changed and you need to change how you communicate your corporate values, the projects that you have, the services that you offer, kind of within that authenticity, values, and quality space. But that's not all, right, Dustin?
Yeah, no, I mean, when we first talked about this topic, and I was we were kind of thinking like, well, what is it like, between December 2022 and December 2023? And if we were doing this all over again, right, or if we were doing this a year before, we probably would have been talking a little bit more about still like employer branding and recruitment and stuff like that. And not that it's not a still a marketing goal and a concern for many different brands. But, unemployment in Maine has fallen down to 2.8%. The national average is down to 3.7%. A lot of the messaging and a lot of the campaigning that we saw throughout the last, 2020 to 2023 was around recruitment, was around, focusing exponential marketing dollars towards these different items. And now that's no longer as much of a concern. So there are some challenges that I think that when we're thinking about our audience, it's not just, their age has also changed, but also, what we're trying to ask them about has changed a lot too. So a lot of businesses were positioned to try to talk about themselves as a recruitment, talking in terms of recruitment, and now are shifting more back to, providing services and products and working towards that bottom line again, and however which way they have to be able to do that. And then of course, we have to kind of think about, how much things have kind of just changed overall. I mean, we are still exiting in a lot of ways, how COVID affected us. Especially from a marketing standpoint. Peter put it pretty eloquently earlier, right? That, we were given a lot more marketing buying power. crisis communications was huge, and going from a sort of method that was positioned around how you're dealing with all of these things, which required you to be nimble and to expand, budgets and take on different projects. Now a lot of that's been reserved, and thinking about how you need to tackle the sort of post-pandemic, sort of pre-recession kind of world that we kind of found ourselves in. Isn't that right, Nick?
Yeah, it's funny that you say pre-recession, Dustin, because I think that's kind of references sort of a crisis that never really came.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason why we identified this as a topic we wanted to have end of year is a lot of people are considering what their budgets are going to look like for 2024. And when we were here a year ago, we were all preparing for a belt tightening recession of some kind. There was a lot of talk about whether we're going to have a soft landing. And it became pretty apparent by around the middle of the year that either we were going to have a soft landing or this was going to be a recession that never hit. And I think because of that, a lot of opportunities passed by for a lot of organizations that I think made, admittedly, a pragmatic choice to not invest heavily in marketing or to not invest in big creative questions. Like a lot of brands and a lot of companies that we've been talking to wanted to have a rebrand, wanted to reposition themselves, but felt like they might have been vulnerable in 2023. That turned out to not really be the case. And I think there's been a lot of lessons learned as a result of 2023, which Dustin will get into a little bit more from a budgetary perspective, that we can learn there. But that soft landing was kind of both an absolute blessing and then a little curse in missed opportunities for a lot of organizations.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the things that when we really take a look at how much has changed and you're thinking about your positioning, know that buying habits are on the move. Like things are changing all over the place. But I think one of the things that I think is fascinating when you're looking through sort of like the data that's been collected through 2023, regardless of what part of the roller coaster we seem to be on, value still was a huge item. Quality was still a huge item. But people's buying habits right now are really prioritized to limited high value products versus that cheap abundance versus that Band-Aid. You're seeing that all across the spectrum, and people are still continuing to, break Black Friday records, right? But inflation is of course playing a huge role in that. But people are buying more, more high quality, more expensive items, and they're making the budget for one or two things. They're making sacrifices on whether they're having it or not having it versus having everything and it's all cheap.
And the way that they're finding these things and buying these things has also changed too. I mean, where social media for a long time was I don't know if that's maybe it's more of a nice to have, or we don't really know how to operate. And then it kind of transitioned to a place where it was social media was a place where, well, I don't know if we're cool enough. I don't know if our audience can be found on social. Maybe we won't be there. That's not the case anymore. That thinking is well behind us. Instagram is a more commonly used search engine than Google for people between the ages of 18 and 27. It's Google's #1 competitor for searches. E-commerce that comes through Instagram ads, for instance, makes up between 30 and 60% of companies right now, because Instagram is allowing us to target our audiences with the kind of clarity and specificity that we're used to having on Facebook, while also giving us more multimedia ways of reaching out and incorporating it, really embedding it intuitively into the system. So, buying habits have not only changed in what we're looking for, but also how we find it and how we purchase, which I think kind of leads us to the next thing we want to talk about, which is thinking bigger. I'm kind of thinking about this in terms of thinking in terms of campaigns, but it's not exclusive to that, really. It comes down to whether you're re-entering the market after a break, or you're just thinking about what your business priorities are. It's really, really, really helpful to think about these things holistically. Omnichannel is a term that some of you may be familiar with. It's more common when you talk about retail organizations, particularly like brick and mortar and online kind of hybrid retail. But the idea about omnichannel as a concept is that it's a seamless experience online or in store, right? So I buy a sweatshirt online, I go and pick it up in store, I bring it home, I try it on, it doesn't fit like I wanted, but I'm traveling, so I go to a different store that's nearby. I can make my same day return, swap for credit, and then use that credit to buy something else on their website, right? That kind of omni-channel experience. This, I think, applies not only to retailers, but I think broadly as a concept, it's the expectation for clients, for customers almost everywhere. Not only the idea that there's flexibility in how you're able to interact with purchases, make changes, etc., online, on the phone, with chat tools, on social media, but also that you look and feel the same across those platforms too, right? So the energy that you have on a post, or the personality that you have in a presentation, if you're doing B2B presentations trying to get big clients, is the same feeling they're going to have when they come to your website or when they look on social media and find examples of the work that you do. It's really important to have that multiple places. I think what happens is you start to get tempted to just try to think in terms of a specific asset you need. And that, I think, is something that you've got a lot of experience with, right, Dustin? The asset only thinking.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we always find is that, when we're thinking big, it usually comes up as that one thing, right? It's a presentation, it's a video, it's something that's going to take a certain amount of resources to be able to build up and be able to use. And I think the biggest challenge where I think most brands found themselves successful in 2023 is that they didn't look at it as just like, well, we're going to do this one thing and this one thing only, and, X, Y, Z. Like, they took a look at it and said, do we need this? If we need this, okay, let's make sure that we maximize the investment we're making because our budgets are tighter than they were in the last couple of years. And I think one of the things that gets lost in that, like the ones who were more successful at doing it versus the ones who weren't, were the ones who realized the ripple effect that you have when you approach things like that. So for a lot of brands, they looked at having a single asset, but didn't think about, is this going to be effective? Is that language, is that consistency, that omni-channel experience you spoke of, Nick, is that felt across, web and video and social and in our written collateral? Like, are we speaking with the same voice, and are we able to project our brand across all these different things? And if not, was it an asset worth investing in? And I think that, there's some winners and losers there for some who really wanted to utilize their marketing budgets in a certain way, but couldn't quite get over the hump of recognizing how many challenges there were with that. We worked on several different rebrands throughout 2023, and the ones that were more successful recognized how much their organization was going to need to invest and change, and those who didn't quite have the same impact were ones who slowly nickel and dimed certain aspects of what they needed to do to make it a more omni-channel experience.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's helpful to think about things in terms of kind of a key insight and then try to extrapolate that out, I think. A good rule of thumb is to understand, like, what's the key thing you understand about your audience, what they want to hear, what your key message is, and then figure out how you can use that other places. So, for example, if you have an old key insight, like, let's say your thought is, we're a local company and people like to buy local. Your new insight might change to be, we're a familiar brand, right? We've been local for so long, people know us, and we build quality, right? Kind of reflective of what we're seeing, which is kind of around changing audiences' perspectives around quality versus cheap and acceptable. If that's the insight that you have and it pivots nicely along that broadening market, it's probably going to require you to not only put together a new advertising strategy, but also some web copy around that, right? To make sure that, like, however you're talking about that, it's reflected online. Or it might require some new photography, stuff where the photos feel like you have an attention to detail and high quality with your images, that then makes your audience feel like you've got that same attention to detail and high quality in your product, right? You can get away with okay photos if you're the local guy that people can trust. But now if you're trying to pivot from local to high quality, you need to make sure that that's reflected across the things that you do, right? So in the earlier example with like a presentation deck, this is exactly where you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is reflected during that pivot, so that you can really kind of go down a bit of a brand journey, really. So we had a client where we had a restaurant client where coming out of COVID, they felt kind of irrelevant, right? Um, which I absolutely understand. Trying to find where you belong in the new status quo after COVID, after people got really used to cooking, might be, does anybody even want to come and eat here anymore? They've spent 2 years getting really good at cooking at home, right? Or are they exhausted from cooking at home and all they want to do is, please God, let somebody else make a meal for me, right? It's kind of unclear what that was. So what they needed to do is they needed to establish general awareness. They needed to reestablish that value proposition of what it is to go out and eat and why that restaurant is relevant, right? So that's kind of the first pivot point that they have. But once they did that, then they're back in the race with other competitors again. Now they've kind of reintroduced themselves, reestablished where they are with those competitors. And so their next campaign needed to be around that food quality, that experience, that service, right? So when we're talking about this idea of repositioning, when we're talking, it goes arm in arm with the idea of campaigns, right? You need to build a specific campaign, a specific effort across multiple platforms that then gets you to the next place. Because coming out of COVID, that restaurant couldn't just say, hey, everybody, we've got great food. It needs to be, hey, everybody, remember us. Hey, everybody, dining out is nice. And then you can kind of bring them along that journey. So it's helpful to think not only in terms of what is our primary insight right now, but where do we want to be positioned at the end of 2024? And what message do we think will allow us to get there? Naturally, that means that we need to talk about testing. You have a theory of the case. This is what we want to tell audiences. This is where we want to be in 12 months. It's helpful to figure out how you want to meet those goals with A/B testing, see what's working, see what's resonating, see what's not. If your audience has changed drastically. What data points you had 3 years ago aren't accurate anymore. So you need to get a new baseline around how's that marketing working? What's resonating with our audience? Is this message that we think is going to be really good? Is that working? And be ready to pivot after, 4 to 6 weeks of playing in that space. Look at the data, be ready to pivot and try something else so that you can not only have used that key insight that you have, but made sure that you actually got traction before you start to pivot to your next messaging. I know that sounds really obvious, guys, but it's really important. Dustin, do you think it's worthwhile taking a quick sec to see if anybody's got thoughts or questions rather than just being lectured to before we jump into the budget planning
that's what
section?
I was thinking.
Yeah.
Nick, one thing I'm interested in is just to hear, I sort of framed the challenge, but I guess sort of if anyone has anything on this and wants to put in chat or wants to unmute and come on, feel welcome to. But like, how internally, what's your budget? What was your budget in 2023, and what's it looking like in 2024? And does it kind of track what we said in the beginning? That's like something. Did it track sort of the history of COVID and sort of the boom, and then everyone being scared? Did it track that? That's something I'm interested in. If anyone has any experience to share. But what specific questions did you and Dustin have, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious if anybody's got if anybody's like, I'm glad I stood by 2023. It's what we had to do. Or if there's a little bit of buyer's remorse, or maybe saver's remorse is the better word, where
Yeah.
folks maybe saw themselves overcome by other competition, or tried to catch up really rapidly at the end of 2023, middle end of 2023. I'm really curious there too, Peter, if anybody there has any thoughts in that space.
Mike, did you have something to say, Mike?
Yeah. Sorry, my video is off right now. I'm not saying, I think it's industry specific. I think that I'm talking about healthcare specifically. I think that the experience going through COVID was very different than in consumer retail, for example. I had a lot of healthcare clients who experienced kind of business. They were really scared going into COVID, but then found that that work picked up, and they really they saw a lot of activity, and basically work came to them through COVID and through the pandemic. I had consumer retail clients where work went away and their businesses just about folded, and they had to do a lot of what you guys just described, as far as, oh my goodness, I better beat the bushes and get the word out there, or my business is going to evaporate. And so it's just very industry specific.
And Mike, what about 2023? Going into 2023, you spoke about COVID, but what was sort of the mindset for those two industries going into 2023?
Yeah, so it's kind of the same dynamic, where it's very industry specific, but 2023 healthcare has taken a very pre-COVID stance. It's almost like business as usual again, and my goodness, this is now the next normal, and I don't use the phrase the new normal anymore, because we don't know what's gonna come. But it's life is here, and we better adapt to it. And so it's this is our world. Consumer retail, the it's kind of the same thing. We're now adapting to the next normal. And I know that that's very non-specific. There's video, but this is our world, and we better learn to live in it. So
I like that term, next normal. That's great. I like that a lot.
yeah,
That's great.
because it reflects for me the fact that we got to keep changing. We got to be able to keep changing, and we got to be nimble and agile.
I think that's a really kind of great transition into how Dustin thinks about the budgeting section too, because so much of what we talked about, and I think what Dustin's going to talk about, is really agility and flexibility. Because, and I'm sure you're all in the same space, you're expected as a member of your company, as a member of the marketing team or sales, to be able to deliver. And that can be really tough when either you're under-resourced, like many, I think, people were in 2023, or you're kind of coming out without the right tools or without the right expectations after a bit of a break. I don't want to spoil stuff though, Dustin. Go ahead, jump in.
No, I mean, I think, we're all talking about the same thing when we think about the roller coaster. And I think that especially when we take a look at this, the current year that we're in, and thinking about what lessons we can kind of learn from it, I think one of the biggest challenges was budgeting and planning. I think we've talked a lot about, some of the more fundamental things, but this is really where most people found themselves most limited. I know that one thing that, we started to see as we got essentially like towards about the middle of the year, we started to see the soft landing really take effect and people start to grasp onto it. We started to see people breaking budgets, going over budget, taking budgets from other items and bringing it into their marketing again. And this is a huge challenge, because especially for many businesses, many brands, many nonprofits, especially, you really have to keep to your structure at the beginning of the year. I think it's good, and as you've said, Mike, to be able to continue to change. I think it's tough because we always look at things in terms of fiscal years and how much we need to adapt and plan for that time ahead of us. So 2022, as everything was starting to look like we were going into a recession, people greatly cut back. And, most people have had one story or another about where that affected them, especially early on in the year. One of the biggest challenges that I have had with a lot of people in the marketing community has been that, not being able to meet their marketing goals, that goals were very tough to be able to meet this year, or budget, or profit was extremely difficult to get to, if you were in a for-profit space. And one of the biggest challenges that, we saw, and we had this great Gartner survey revealed that 71% of CMOs believe that they lacked a sufficient budget to fully execute their strategy in 2023 as early as May. In May, they were believing that they were not going to have enough to be able to actually get to their goals. And it's been a struggle for many to continue to do that as they went throughout the rest of the year, because they did not budget appropriately for what could be possible. So one of the things that we've kind of looked through and had those conversations, talked to the clients, talked with other people in the marketing space, it's like, well, what did success look like? And one of the things was being flexible, being able to live into the next normal, and being able to be a little bit lighter on their feet. When we look at 2024, and we have a little bit more of a wrap up on that, but I think one of the challenges that we look at now, trying to measure the data that we have from 2023, there's a lot of market forces at play, something that we need to be really mindful of as we continue to plan. High interest rates are still going to be around for next year. We need to plan on that, and regardless if that's a B2C or B2B space. Consumer behavior is changing a lot, and especially for those who are ignoring Gen Z, you need to really keep on top of that. We've got a presidential election next year. I don't know if anybody has been paying attention, but it's always a classic every 4 years for us, or around that time, when there is a presidential election. It's higher advertising rates. It means that there are huge chunks of the entire year that's more difficult to get in front of your usual audience. So knowing that there's going to be challenges ahead, planning around that, planning through that can be very difficult, and it can be tough because it's going to throw data at it's going to throw data off if you continue to keep routine going through a year like that. And then, don't ignore where you're spending your money. We talked a little bit about that one asset that it gets invested in, and then, has to be used for execution because you convince somebody to have that within your budget. Allow yourself to plan to make a splash, knowing that you got to be able to keep that consistent across all of your omni-channel experience, and allow yourself to invest in your brand. Always make sure that there is at least a little bit to approach.
I think we just had an errant microphone. I think we're okay.
Oh, there we go. I was like, that's coming out of nowhere. But yeah, allow yourself to invest in your brand at the end of the day. There's always an opportunity, throughout the year where you're more than likely going to need to be able to pivot. You're going to need to be able to change, and restricting your budget to a point where you're not going to be flexible, where you're not going to be nimble is going to only hurt you at the end. Oh, Nick, I think you're muted too. Oh, nope, still muted.
There we
There you
go.
go.
That might have been me that muted you, Nick.
Wow,
Sorry
Peter.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Shots fired, man. All right, then I think the key takeaways here. I think the big one on my end is 2024 is just a really big leverage point for everybody. It's a good leverage point too. I think we have ample lessons to draw from. There's been a lot of data. You can see what a lot of other organizations have done across industries between 2020 and 2023. So it's really easy for us to draw lessons right now without trying to learn them the hard way. And that means that I think two things are happening. One, we have the data we need to be effective. But two, we have the data we need to build compelling arguments for our budget choices. I think now is a really, I think if you're a marketer, if you're looking to change your creative space, if you're trying to convince yourself as an owner that it's a good time to spend money, it's really easy to do that when you look at where a lot of the data points are right now. There's a lot of data to support decision making. The second thing is, not only is this a good time for well-informed investments in time, money, and energy, but it's also a good time. It's a good time to make those investments given where the state of marketing and creative is right now. AI tools, you're not going to get out of a webinar without hearing about AI now. AI tools have made marketing and creative a lot more efficient than they were. And a withdrawal from advertising the last several years have made advertising more affordable than it was before, because there's been a little bit of a drop in that market. A year from now, AI is moving so quickly that I think you're probably going to see AI making things more difficult than they are in 2024. I think that as AI advances, you're going to see a lot of upheaval in the marketing and creative spaces. I think you're going to see kind of drastic changes in cost. I think you're also going to see different expectations from consumers around using or not using AI. I think you're broadly going to see a big pushback around the obvious use of AI, kind of alongside that increasing conversation amongst consumers about authenticity and build quality, right? If you're all about quality and you're all about authenticity, but all of your advertising looks like it's been made in 30 minutes with key phrases with AI, it kind of undermines a little bit that brand. So right now, AI tools are being largely used as early on ideation tools or first draft materials. That's going to save you money with your marketing team. That's going to save you money with the creative agency right now. It's probably going to be a trap a little later on. So this is like a great time, I think, when you want to make those investments. And then Dustin can speak a little bit more to when we're talking about kind of how we budget for the year, given where advertising cost and marketing spend lives.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is everybody, has to eventually, set themselves down here. And most of you may already be through your budgets, or you are in the middle of getting through your budgets and you're looking at some of those last minute approvals between now and January, depending on your fiscal year. So budget for success. I mean, it's the most important thing when looking over the winners and losers of 2023 are the ones that allowed to have a little bit more flexibility in their budget, a little bit more, a little bit more wiggle room for potential splashes that they needed to make throughout the year. And those are the ones that came out on top. So, I think as far as a lot of people were planning their budgets last year, they were only looking so far ahead. And because they didn't look a full 12 months, they didn't try to budget for what they think they were going to need. A lot of them, like I said, broke budgets, went over budget. And that's, at the end of the day, you have to take a look, like, you went over budget and did you make your marketing goals? Like, those are tough conversations to have as a marketing team, or as the sole marketing person to a CEO or an executive director. Those are not fun conversations. So, plan to succeed, and, know that, keep what you don't use, but make sure that you budget to make sure that you're going to potentially have something. And always, as Nick put it, use your data points and know that, like, as a business, a for-profit business, you need to be spending anywhere between 2 to 5% of your revenue to be able to keep yourself competitive. And nonprofits should expect, 5 to 15%, depending on the way that they attain revenue. So knowing that you have to be able to adjust for your brand is a very important piece. And then, break routines. I think one of the biggest challenges that we saw this year was when so many of these budgets got cut back. So many routine objects were kind of like there as just like matter of fact. Well, we always do this and we always do that in our marketing plan. And the real question is to really take a step back and say, like, do we need that? Do we need that? Do we need certain advertisement in certain areas? Do we need to be on radio? Like, make real decisions around, assess those marketing dollars on, are they being effective? And if they are being effective, by what, by how much of a degree? And, if that's where you need to cut to be able to afford the big splash, figure that configuration out. It's a big challenge, but keeping routine marketing is not what's going to keep you nimble, and it's not going to get you ahead.
And if you don't know, ask. I mean, there's a lot of material out there you can look up, but also, your friendly neighborhood marketing creative agency over here. You don't have to agree to do a big long-term project with us to sit down and pick our brains a little bit and get some sense as to some of the insights that we have and maybe some direction that would make sense, particularly around the audiences you're trying to hit with some of the more traditional media platforms that we're talking about, because of the impact of the election, be, whether there's the national election was going to have a big impact on the audiences you're trying to reach, on the platforms you're trying to use in the latter half of the year or not. But also just around subscription rates to, cable. There's so many cord cutters. The things that people do and how they behave as to whether they're going to actually be engaging on some of the platforms you want. You'd be surprised if you're trying to find business owners or small business owners, whether radio or TV is more effective based on the time they keep and the time they have to sit down and put their feet up and watch local news, for instance. So there's a lot of considerations that I think you can make, and there's a lot of places to access that information, including us. So,
Indeed.
I think that's all I had to say. Dustin, did you have anything else that you wanted to say? Do we want to see if anybody's got any questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, anyone in the crowd, it's been a long year. I know many of you, we've worked on, some of you are friends and clients, and we've worked together on a couple of different things here and there. So,
Hey, Dustin, can I just
Yeah.
correct you? It's been a long 3 years. It's
been a-
it's been a really long 3 years.
well put.
We've all been through a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And hopefully the next normal is like the last 3 years. I love that term that Mike gave us.
Oh.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask. We really wanted to keep this a light webinar, and that was great, Nick and Dustin. If any questions come up outside of the webinar, I put Dustin his email here, also his phone number. And then also, feel free to follow us on social, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. You can message us there as well. And if, unless I hear someone chime in soon, we hope you
I
all
just
have-
want to say, I thank you guys for hosting these webinars, for throwing these out there. It's very helpful. I keep encouraging clients to maintain and even increase their marketing budgets during tough times. If they think a recession is coming, they want to not only capture sales, but they also want to be there with their messaging whenever their competitors stumble. So this is great. And,
Yeah.
and I just appreciate you guys putting these out there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. I think uncertain times, there's a lot of opportunities in uncertain times. So being consistent with your marketing is a great way to take advantage of that.
Yeah,
Indeed.
never let a crisis go to waste, right?
Oh yes.
I guess Peter, Dustin, and Nick, thanks for the webinar. Quick question about when it comes to convincing people, I guess in the company above you, about marketing budgets and convincing them, hey, we really can't slow down regardless of what's going on economically. I'm super lucky at my company. My CEO is a marketing guy through and through, and he's really given our team a lot of freedom and a lot of confidence in our budget. So we didn't really have too much of an issue for 23 versus 22 and vice versa for 2024. But I do have friends who are in other companies who are just struggling to convince people who aren't very marketing versed, and they just don't, they're all bottom line thinking only. I guess, where would you come at it from an advice standpoint, or how to convince them to give the marketing teams freedom that they need?
Well, I'm going to let Dustin take a first stab at it, since part of his job is convincing people to spend money. And then I'd be happy to chime in.
I mean, I think, what I always try to couch it in two different arenas. And I think the first and foremost is always thinking about success. I think that the reason why it's not invested in is because they don't believe it'll be successful, or they think that success is inherent, which is not always a good way for a brand to have. And regardless of whether it's a for-profit or a non-profit, assuming success is a very dangerous thing, especially in uncertain times. So I always go with, you put insurance on so many things in your life. Why would you not put insurance on success? And make sure that you have a policy to be able to get above and beyond where you currently are. that's my usual kind of approach is really thinking about, like, if one is cutting back, they're usually thinking about taking away from something that's not needed. And marketing is always needed. You can find a lot of data around that kind of aspect. And I'm sure, Nick, you can talk a little bit to the data aspect of it.
I guess one thing
Uh,
I would just throw in quickly, Nick, is just making sure it's addressing the biggest, the marketing or branding efforts is addressing the biggest challenge for the organization. So
Hmm.
if that individual is advocating for, we need to promote this service line or this product more, but the executive real challenge is hiring more talent, then this communications professional needs to shift and advocate for marketing and branding efforts that are gonna, push the biggest challenge for the organization, which might be recruitment or some other challenge that's not like product or service line driven.
I have two strong opinions on this. The first one is whether your CEO or EVP is right is irrelevant. You have to function from the perspective that they are right. So if they say this is our most important problem, to Peter's point, or this is the thing that matters, fine. Start with the perspective that they are correct in their assumption of what's going on, and instead of trying to convince them they're not, I think you need to recontextualize your argument in terms of how it supports their thesis of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, unless they're wildly off and you need like the board of directors to like vote them out, like you're going to have to work within the reality that they've established. I think a good way to do that, and something that feels like a pretty universal argument to make, because Ed, I think you're kind of and correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like you're referring a little bit to the fact that when people are very bottom line, advertising and marketing that doesn't immediately equal you spent $3, you got $5 back on that ad, can sometimes be hard to defend.
Correct.
I think I think a good argument for that being a trailing indicator, right, of success, is how deeply tribal we've become. I think that's something that we can all kind of agree on and see very clearly. You know what I mean? People don't vote split ticket anymore. People are Republicans or Democrats. People don't, and this is maybe less of a case in Maine a little bit, but people don't own a gun but keep it in a safe. People are gun owners and they're advocates for guns, or they're not and they don't like guns. You know what I mean? We've kind of moved to our respective corners on a lot of issues. And that includes the brands that we associate ourselves with and what those brands mean for us. So whether I bank at Charles Schwab because I'm an international man who travels the world and I need an international bank, or I bank local because my community matters. And it's actually really clever when you know who you bank with. You can really, as an example, right? Helping to clarify who you are and what team you're a part of and what culture you're associated with. That's really important. You need to allow people to understand how their tribe matches with you. And so it's not just a question of a value proposition, or you need a bank right now, for instance. I'm going kind of bank oriented a little bit for you, Ed, right? Or we're talking about a credit union, or it's not those little details. It's, why does your value proposition align with my personal identity? And that means that a lot of the advertising you're doing to speak to that tribal space goes outside of value proposition and goes into, well, I saw you here, or this ad said that, or I see that you're associated with these other brands that I also associate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You start beating a drum, you start building a rhythm, and then people start to decide that they want to be associated with you. And I think that's true of B2B organizations. I think that's true of who's your supplier. I can't believe you're using those guys. They're so cheap, or I'm so glad you're using those guys. They're so economical. You need to invest in advertising that kind of creates that long-term establishment of who you are. And I think that tribal argument has been successful for me in having conversations with brands. But I'm curious if that resonates with anybody else. That might be my own twisted view of the world.
All really great answers from Peter, Dustin, and Nick. Appreciate that a lot.
Sure.
So Nick, what you said to me, where you say, assume the person is right and speak to their needs, is really resonates with me. The approach that I use and again, I'm working with clients to be effective with them, is some people are data driven and some people are feelings driven. And these are not extremes. They're obvious. This is a spectrum and there's a blend in there. But if a person is really data driven, then I may need to speak to them about customer acquisition costs, and I may need to speak to them about hard numbers, and I may need to collect some of that data and be able to present to them in a language that they can relate to and speaks to them about results and how to get those results. And if a person is really emotionally driven or feelings driven, then I may need to speak to them using anecdotes and using examples and using other means. And they may not give a rip about customer acquisition cost or things like that. And so what you just mentioned, Nick, about assume that person is right and go to them where they are is really an effective, I think, approach to take, and getting them to understand the significance of, in this context, we're talking about marketing budgets, but it could be anything. And maybe it's supporting a project, maybe it's who knows what, but right now we're talking about marketing investment, and going to them where they are and speaking their language and understanding the investment, that $3 investment to achieve that $5 return again. And even though that $5 return may be next year or even the year after, to still justify that $3 investment.
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing too is, you know, I was thinking about that in terms of, and I realize that you have clients that you're talking about it from a client perspective. You know, I was thinking about it very much in terms of if I'm the in-house marketing guy, because you also, if you need to make two arguments at once, if they are wrong, right? And their approach is wrong, and then you need to bring in somebody external. You need to bring in a consultant or an agency or somebody that that brings with them a certain amount of expertise or panache that allows them to maybe make that argument for you. That's often, I mean, there's been more than a few occasions where we get called in, not because we're doing a big project or a big push, but we're being called in because they need some more people in their corner or some extra voices that just, I would say often unfairly legitimize the point, you know, because in-house, they know what they're talking about. They're just as good as we are, but they need that external voice to come in and legitimize some of these perspectives too. So, you know, yeah, sometimes you just got to call in backup, you know?
Yeah.
Well, great. We're getting close to the end of the hour. Thank you all again. Good to hear from you, and we hope you all have a great holiday and look forward to 2024.
Indeed. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.